The blizzard had been raging for 3 days when Marcus Sullivan first saw the dark shape moving across the white expanse. At first he thought it was a wounded deer, the way it moved so slowly, dragging itself through the knee-deep snow that had transformed the Montana wilderness into an unforgiving wasteland. The wind howled through the pine trees surrounding his isolated cabin, carrying with it the kind of cold that could kill a man in minutes if he wasn't prepared. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus stood at his kitchen window, coffee mug steaming in his calloused hands, watching the shape struggle across the clearing 200 yards from his front door. The storm had knocked out power lines for miles, leaving him cut off from the outside world, but that was nothing new. He'd chosen this life of solitude deliberately, building his cabin deep in the Glacier National Forest, where the nearest neighbor was 15 miles away and the nearest town was 30. The shape stumbled, fell forward into the snow, and didn't get up. Marcus set down his coffee and reached for the binoculars on the windowsill. Through the lens, what he saw made his blood freeze colder than the Montana air. It wasn't a deer. It was a woman, crawling on her hands and knees through the snow, wearing nothing but a torn nightgown that had once been white but was now stained with blood and dirt. Without hesitation, Marcus grabbed his heavy winter coat from the hook by the door, pulled on his insulated boots, and stepped out into the storm. The wind hit him like a physical blow, driving snow crystals into his face. With the force of tiny bullets, he'd survived 2 tours in Afghanistan, 8 years as a search and rescue specialist, and the last 5 years living alone in these mountains. But the sight of that woman crawling through the snow triggered something primal in him. He ran. The snow was deeper than it looked from inside, reaching nearly to his knees in some drifts. Each step was a battle against the wind and the weight of accumulated snow on his legs. The woman had made it perhaps 50 yards closer to his cabin before collapsing completely. As Marcus fought his way toward her, he could see a trail of disturbed snow marking her path, dark spots where blood had melted through the white surface. She was unconscious when he reached her, face down in the snow, her dark hair matted with ice and blood. Marcus knelt beside her, his hands moving with practiced efficiency born from years of emergency training. He checked her pulse first, pressing 2 fingers against her neck beneath the frozen hair, weak but steady. Her skin was pale blue from cold exposure, lips nearly purple, but she was breathing. Gently he turned her over, and what he saw made his jaw clench with a rage he hadn't felt since his military days. Her face was a map of violence, swollen and bruised in shades of purple and black. Her left eye was swollen, completely shut, and dried blood crusted around her nose and mouth. Bruises in the distinct shape of fingers marked her throat. Someone had beaten this woman savagely before she'd somehow escaped into the storm, but it was her eyes that stopped him cold. Her right eye flickered open, focusing on his face with an intensity that cut through the haze of pain and hypothermia. There was no pleading in that gaze, no helpless desperation. Instead, he saw something harder, more determined. She was looking at him like she was measuring him, deciding whether he was another threat or possibly, finally, someone safe. "Help," she whispered, the word barely audible over the wind, but her tone carried a strength that didn't match her broken appearance. Marcus didn't waste time with questions. He slipped one arm beneath her knees and the other behind her shoulders, lifting her from the snow with the care he'd once used for handling wounded soldiers. She weighed almost nothing, her body reduced to sharp angles and hollow spaces that spoke of prolonged mistreatment. The nightgown she wore was soaked through and offered no protection against the sub-zero temperatures. The journey back to his cabin felt like miles instead of yards. The woman drifted in and out of consciousness against his chest, occasionally mumbling words he couldn't make out over the storm. Once, she gripped his coat with surprising strength and whispered, "They can't find me. Promise they can't find me." Marcus kicked open his front door and carried her directly to the bathroom, where he'd installed a deep soaking tub years earlier. He set her gently on the closed toilet seat while he started running warm water, testing the temperature carefully. With his hand, too hot would shock her system. Too cold wouldn't help her core temperature. "I need to get you out of these wet clothes," he said, keeping his voice calm and professional. "You're hypothermic. The wet fabric will keep pulling heat from your body." She nodded slightly, trying to lift her arms to help but lacking the strength. Her fingers were stiff and clumsy from the cold, unable to grip the fabric. Marcus found a pair of scissors in the medicine cabinet and carefully cut away the nightgown, averting his eyes as much as possible while still ensuring he removed all the wet material. What he saw made his hands shake with suppressed anger. The bruises extended far beyond her face. Her ribs showed the distinctive marks of kicks and punches, some bruises fresh and dark, others yellowing with age. Rope burns circled her wrists, raw and infected. Burns that looked deliberately inflicted marked her shoulders and arms in perfect circles, the unmistakable signature of cigarettes pressed against skin. Marcus had seen torture victims before, but never someone who had endured such systematic, prolonged abuse. This wasn't the result of a single violent encounter. Someone had been hurting this woman for a long time. He helped her into the warm bath, supporting her weight as she sank into the water. She gasped at the initial contact, her body instinctively recoiling from the temperature change. But then she relaxed slightly as the warmth began to penetrate her frozen skin. "What's your name?" Marcus asked, kneeling beside the tub with a washcloth in his hand. "Elena," she whispered, then seemed to consider whether she should have given him that information. "Elena Rodriguez. I'm Marcus Sullivan. You're safe here. Elena, no one's going to hurt you." She studied his face again with that same measuring look. "You were military," she said, not asking but stating a fact. Marcus nodded, surprised by her perception despite her condition. "Army Rangers. How did you know?" "The way you move. The way you check me for injuries. The way you're not asking 100 questions." She paused, wincing as she shifted in the water. "And the fact that you carried a half-dead stranger into your house without hesitation." As the warm water began to restore circulation to her extremities, Elena's story emerged in fragments. She'd been held captive for 8 months by her ex-husband and his brother, who had found her after she'd tried to disappear following their divorce. They'd taken her to a remote compound in the mountains, a place where her screams couldn't reach anyone who might help. "I waited for the storm," she said, her voice growing stronger as feeling returned to her body. "I knew they wouldn't expect me to run in weather like this. I've been planning it for weeks, waiting for the right conditions." Marcus cleaned the wounds he could see, applying antibiotic ointment and bandages with the methodical care of someone trained in field medicine. Elena never flinched, never cried out, even when he had to clean infections that must have been agonizing. Her tolerance for pain spoke to months of conditioning that no one should have to endure. "How far did you walk?" he asked. "I don't know. Started before dawn. Maybe 10 miles, 12? Elena's voice carried a note of pride despite her exhaustion. "I followed power lines until I saw your cabin lights." Marcus did quick mental calculations. 12 miles through a blizzard, in the dark, wearing only a nightgown with injuries that would have kept most people bedridden. The woman sitting in his bathtub had accomplished something that would have challenged trained survival experts. "Elena," he said carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Are they going to come looking for you?" Her expression hardened, and for a moment he glimpsed the steel beneath her battered exterior. "They'll come, but not tonight. Maybe not tomorrow with this storm, but they'll come." "How many?" 3, my ex-husband David Martinez, his brother Carlos, and a man they call Tank. David's got connections with some very dangerous people. They won't just let me disappear." Marcus nodded, his mind already shifting into tactical mode. "Can you describe the compound? How are they armed? What kind of vehicles do they have?" Elena's eyes sharpened with interest. "You're not going to try to convince me to call the police, are you? Are the police an option?" David has a cousin who's a sheriff's deputy in Flathead County. And enough money to make problems disappear. Elena's laugh was bitter. "I tried calling for help once, 6 months ago. The deputy who responded said there was no evidence of wrongdoing and suggested I stop making false accusations that could damage my ex-husband's reputation." Marcus felt a familiar rage building in his chest, the same anger that had driven him to leave civilization behind after watching too many good people get hurt while bad people walked free. The system that was supposed to protect the innocent had failed this woman completely. "Then we handle this ourselves," he said simply. Elena stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether he was serious. "You don't know what you're offering. These aren't just angry rednecks with shotguns. David has military training too, and money, and connections. They'll kill you without hesitation." "Elena," Marcus said, meeting her gaze directly, "I spent 8 years pulling people out of situations where the cavalry wasn't coming. I didn't stop doing that because I moved to the mountains." Something shifted in Elena's expression, a crack in the defensive wall she'd built around herself. For the first time since he'd found her, she looked vulnerable. But it wasn't the vulnerability of a victim. It was the vulnerability of someone who had been strong for so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone offer to share the burden. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Why?" she asked quietly. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." Marcus considered the question, thinking about the choices that had led him to this isolated cabin, this moment of decision that would change both their lives. "Because someone needs to," he said finally. "And because I think you've been fighting alone long enough." The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the small bathroom, something fundamental had shifted. Elena Rodriguez was no longer just a victim who had crawled through the snow seeking refuge. Marcus Sullivan was no longer just a hermit hiding from the world's problems. They were becoming something else, something neither of them had expected. Partners. As Marcus helped Elena from the tub and wrapped her in warm towels, he was already planning. His cabin was well stocked and defensible, situated on high ground with clear sightlines in all directions. He had weapons, supplies, and most importantly, the tactical knowledge to use both effectively. But more than that, he was beginning to understand that Elena Rodriguez wasn't just someone who needed rescuing. Despite everything she'd endured, despite the injuries and the trauma and the 8 months of captivity, there was an unbroken core of strength in her that matched his own. The men who had hurt her were coming. When they arrived, they would find themselves facing not just one highly trained ex-soldier, but 2 people who had nothing left to lose and every reason to fight. The real battle was just beginning. Elena slept for 18 hours straight, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion once it recognized safety. Marcus checked on her every few hours, noting the gradual return of color to her skin and the way her breathing deepened as hypothermia released its grip. He'd given her his bedroom while he made do with the couch, keeping the wood-burning stove fed throughout the night to maintain warmth throughout the cabin. When she finally woke, it was the smell of bacon and coffee. Marcus heard her moving around upstairs, the careful footsteps of someone testing their body's limits. He'd left clean clothes on the dresser, his smallest flannel shirt and a pair of hiking pants with a belt, along with thick wool socks. Everything would be too large for her, but it would be warm and dry. She appeared at the top of the stairs 20 minutes later, moving slowly but under her own power. The swelling in her face had gone down considerably, though the bruises had deepened into spectacular shades of purple and green. She'd braided her dark hair back, revealing the full extent of the damage to her features, but also showcasing eyes that were alert and calculating. "How do you feel?" Marcus asked, flipping pancakes on the cast iron griddle he'd inherited from his grandfather. "Like I got hit by a truck." Elena's voice was hoarse, but stronger than the night before. "But alive, which is more than I expected yesterday." She moved to the large windows that dominated the cabin's main room, studying the landscape beyond. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a world transformed by 3 feet of fresh snow. Towering pine trees stood like sentinels in the morning light, their branches heavy with white powder. The silence was absolute except for the occasional crack of settling wood and the whisper of wind through the forest. "How long have you lived here?" Elena asked, accepting the plate of food Marcus offered. 5 years. Built most of it myself." Marcus gestured around the cabin's interior, which reflected both military precision and mountain practicality. Everything had its place, from the carefully organized shelves of supplies to the weapon rack, mounted discreetly behind the front door. "Bought the land with my discharge pay and savings." Elena studied the space with the same intensity she'd shown when first looking at his face. The cabin was roughly 1,000 square feet, with an open floor plan that combined kitchen, dining, and living areas. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, flanked by built-in bookshelves filled with military histories, survival manuals, and classic literature. The furniture was simple but well-made, mostly wood crafted by hand. "You're off the grid," she observed, noting the solar panels visible through the window and the absence of typical electrical appliances. "Mostly, I've got solar power, a backup generator, and a satellite phone for emergencies. Water comes from a well I drilled myself, and heat comes from wood I cut myself." Marcus poured coffee into 2 heavy ceramic mugs. "Everything I need to be completely self-sufficient, running from something." The question was asked casually, but Marcus caught the underlying assessment. Elena was evaluating him, trying to determine what kind of man would choose such isolation. Running to something, maybe. Marcus sat across from her at the small wooden table. "I got tired of watching the system fail people who deserved better. Figured if I couldn't fix it, I'd at least remove myself from being part of the problem." Elena ate slowly, clearly favoring her left side, where the worst of the rib damage was located. Between bites, she continued her visual inventory of the cabin, cataloging details with the thoroughness of someone trained to notice everything. "You were more than just a ranger," she said. "It wasn't a question. Special operations. Did some work that doesn't officially exist for agencies that don't officially employ contractors." Marcus met her gaze directly. "What gave it away?" "The way you set up this space. Clear sight lines to all approaches, furniture positioned to provide cover, multiple exit routes planned. And the fact that you have enough supplies here to survive a siege." Elena gestured toward the kitchen, where she'd noticed the industrial-sized containers of rice, beans, and other staples. "This isn't just a cabin. It's a fortified position." Marcus felt a grudging admiration for her observational skills. Most people saw only a rustic mountain retreat when they looked at his home. Elena saw it for what it really was, a carefully planned defensive position that could be held indefinitely by someone who knew what they were doing. "Your turn," he said. "Before you married David Martinez, what were you?" Elena's expression closed. Off slightly, old habits of secrecy reasserting themselves. Then she seemed to make a conscious decision to trust him with the truth. She said quietly. "Undercover operations, primarily along the Mexican border. I specialized in infiltrating drug trafficking organizations, gathering intelligence on their financial networks and distribution methods." Marcus felt pieces clicking into place. Elena's ability to read people, her tactical awareness, her refusal to show weakness even while severely injured, all made sense now. She wasn't just an abuse victim who had shown remarkable courage. She was a trained federal agent who had somehow ended up in a situation that had nearly destroyed her. How does a agent end up married to someone connected to dangerous people? Marcus asked carefully. Elena stared out the window for a long moment before answering. David was part of an operation. I was supposed to get close to him to gather intelligence on his family's money laundering activities. The Martinez family has been moving cartel money through legitimate businesses for decades. And you fell for him? I thought I did. David can be very charming when he wants to be. Cultured, intelligent, seemingly different from the rest of his family. Elena's voice carried the bitter edge of someone who had been expertly manipulated. I was deep undercover for 8 months before I realized he'd known who I was from the beginning. Marcus felt cold that had nothing to do with the mountain air. He was playing you. The whole time. Feeding me just enough real information to keep my handlers happy while learning everything about our investigation. When the operation finally went down, half our targets had disappeared and the other half had lawyers waiting. Elena's hands tightened around her coffee mug. 3 agents died in raids that turned into ambushes. Good people with families. And you? My cover held just long enough for David to propose. I thought I was still in control, that I could gather enough evidence to bring down the whole network. Elena's laugh was hollow. Instead, I ended up married to a man who had orchestrated the deaths of my colleagues and planned to use me as his personal trophy. Marcus was beginning to understand the depth of Elena's situation. This wasn't just domestic abuse. It was a calculated campaign of psychological warfare, conducted by someone with the resources and connections to make problems disappear permanently. How long were you married before you realized what he really was? About 6 months. David's very good at maintaining facades, but eventually the mask slips. Elena touched her throat unconsciously, where faded finger marks were still visible. The first time he hit me, I tried to leave. That's when I learned that my career had been quietly terminated due to reliability concerns, and that David had somehow gained access to my personal files, including the identities of my family members. He threatened your family. My sister. Lives in Phoenix with her 2 young children. David made it very clear that my cooperation was the only thing keeping them safe. Elena's voice remained steady, but Marcus could see the cost of that control in the tension around her eyes. So I stayed, and I endured, and I planned. Marcus stood and moved to the window, processing what Elena had told him. Outside, the forest stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful and unforgiving. Somewhere out there, dangerous men were probably planning their next move, unaware that their victim had found refuge with someone capable of fighting back. The compound where they held you, Marcus said. Tell me about it. Elena joined him at the window, standing close enough that he could smell the soap she'd used, a clean scent that couldn't quite mask the underlying tension in her body. It's about 30 miles northeast of here, built into a natural valley between 2 ridges. David bought it through shell companies. Officially, it's a hunting lodge. In reality, it's where the Martinez family conducts business they don't want traced back to them. How many buildings? Main lodge, 2 smaller cabins, a workshop that's actually a sophisticated communications center, and a garage that houses armored vehicles. Elena's recall was precise, the product of training that had become second nature. The whole place is surrounded by a 10-foot fence topped with razor wire, motion sensors along the perimeter, and cameras covering every approach. Personnel? Varies. Sometimes just David, Carlos, and Tank. Other times there are meetings with 12 or 15. People, all armed, all dangerous. Elena paused, her expression darkening. David's paranoid enough to assume someone's always watching, so security is constant. Marcus absorbed the tactical information. mentally mapping the challenges such a facility would present. Well-funded, professionally secured, situated in terrain that favored defenders over attackers. The kind of target that would require extensive planning and resources to assault successfully. "They'll come for you," he said. "Probably once the roads are clear enough to make the trip safely." Yes, David can't afford to let me disappear. I know too much about his operations, and more importantly, I represent a challenge to his control. Elena turned to face Marcus directly. "But it's not just about me anymore. You've seen me. You know I exist. You could potentially testify about my condition. David doesn't leave loose ends. Then we make sure he doesn't get the chance to tie them up." Elena studied his profile as he continued to watch the forest. "You're serious about this? About helping me? I don't make offers I don't intend to keep. This could get you killed, Marcus. David has resources you can't imagine. Money, connections, people who owe him favors. He's not just some abusive husband. You can intimidate into backing down." Marcus turned to meet her gaze, and Elena saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. It was the look of a man who had walked into impossible situations before and emerged victorious. Not because he was fearless, but because he was willing to pay whatever price victory required. "Elena," he said quietly, "I've been looking for a reason to stop hiding up here and start making a difference again. You just gave me one." The weight of his commitment settled between them, changing the dynamic of their relationship in ways that would take time to fully understand. Elena had spent months as a victim, then hours as a refugee seeking shelter. Now she was being offered something she'd almost forgotten existed: genuine partnership with someone who saw her as an equal rather than a problem to be managed. "If we're going to do this," she said finally, "we do it right. No half measures, no mercy for people who traffic in human misery." "Agreed." Elena moved to the weapon rack near the front door, examining Marcus's collection with professional interest. Military-grade rifles, tactical shotguns, handguns in various calibers, all meticulously maintained and ready for use. "I'll need a weapon," she said. "Something I can handle accurately despite the rib damage." Marcus selected a compact 9mm pistol and a shoulder holster designed for easy concealment. This should work. Light recoil, reliable action, and it won't aggravate your injuries. Elena accepted the weapon, checking the action with practiced efficiency before securing it in the holster. The weight of the gun against her ribs was both comforting and sobering, a reminder that her fight for freedom was far from over. "How long do you think we have?" Marcus asked. "With the roads the way they are? Maybe 48 hours before they can safely make the trip." David's cautious when it comes to risking his own skin. Elena moved back to the window, studying the terrain with a new purpose. "But when they come, they'll come prepared for war." Marcus smiled grimly. "Then we better make sure we're ready to give them one." As if summoned by his words, the satellite phone on Marcus's desk began to ring. Both of them froze, staring at the device that represented their only connection to the outside world. Marcus rarely received calls, and the timing of this one seemed ominous. He answered on the fourth ring. "Sullivan." "Marcus, it's Jake Henderson from town." The voice belonged to the owner of the general store in Whitefish, one of the few people who had Marcus's satellite number. "Listen, I've got some folks here asking questions about strangers in the area. Thought you should know." Marcus felt Elena's attention sharpen beside him. "What kind of folks, Jake?" "3 men in a black SUV with out-of-state plates. Well-dressed. But something off about them. They're asking about any unusual activity in the forest. Anyone who might have taken in a woman who was in trouble." "What did you tell them?" "Nothing. Told them the storms had everyone hunkered down, and I haven't seen or heard anything unusual." Jake's voice carried an undertone of concern. "But Marcus, these guys aren't giving up easy. They're offering money for information, and you know how folks are when times are tight." Marcus exchanged a look with Elena, whose expression had gone cold with recognition. "Jake, do me a favor. If anyone asks about me specifically, you've never heard my name. And if you see that SUV heading toward the forest roads, you call me immediately." "Will do. You in some kind of trouble, Marcus?" "Nothing I can't handle. Thanks for the heads up." Marcus ended the call and turned to Elena, who was already moving toward the stairs. "They're here," she said grimly. "David doesn't waste time when he wants something. How could they have tracked you this quickly? Blood trail in the snow. It stopped snowing 8 hours ago, which means the trail I left is probably still visible from the air." Elena was already at the top of the stairs. "David has a helicopter at the compound. If they did an aerial search this morning, they could have followed my path right to your door." Marcus felt his mind shifting into combat mode, the familiar. Clarity that came with accepting inevitable conflict. "Then we assume they know where we are and plan accordingly." "Marcus," Elena called from the bedroom, "we need to assume they'll be here within hours, not days." The hunt had begun. Elena descended the stairs wearing Marcus's tactical vest over the flannel shirt, the 9mm secured in its shoulder holster. She'd found a baseball cap that helped conceal the worst of her facial bruising, and despite moving carefully due to her injuries, there was something different about her demeanor. The victim who had crawled through the snow was gone, replaced by a federal agent preparing for battle. "We need to move the vehicles," she said without preamble. "If they're doing aerial reconnaissance, they'll spot your truck immediately." Marcus nodded, already pulling on his winter gear. "There's a maintenance shed about half a mile north, built into the hillside. It's camouflaged from above and accessible by an old logging road that doesn't show on most maps. They work together with the efficiency of trained professionals." Though Marcus noticed Elena favoring her left side and the way she occasionally pressed a hand to her ribs when she thought he wasn't looking. Still, she never complained or asked for help she didn't absolutely need. The shed was exactly as Marcus had described, a structure so well hidden that Elena didn't see it until they were 50 yards away. Built into a natural depression and covered with timber that matched the surrounding forest, it was invisible from any aerial view. "How many of these hidey holes do you have scattered around your property?" Elena asked as Marcus backed his Ford F-250 into the concealed space. "7 that are fully stocked, 3 more that are just emergency shelters." Marcus secured the shed doors and activated a small solar panel that would keep the truck's battery maintained. Old habits from forward operating bases. Never have. Just one of anything important. As they hiked back toward the cabin through snow that reached their knees, Elena found herself studying Marcus with new appreciation. His movements through the forest were completely silent despite the challenging terrain, and he seemed to navigate by instincts that went deeper than mere familiarity with the area. "How much of this land do you actually own?" she asked. "Officially?" "About 40 acres. Unofficially, I've got use agreements with the Forest Service for another 200 acres that buffer my property." Marcus paused at a bend in the trail, scanning the area ahead with practiced caution. The beauty of being a decorated veteran with a clean record is that government agencies tend to approve your permit applications. Elena smiled despite their circumstances. "So you've basically created your own private military installation in the middle of Montana. More like a strategic withdrawal position with excellent defensive characteristics." Marcus resumed walking, but Elena caught the slight grin that crossed his face. "But yeah, essentially." Back at the cabin, they began preparations in earnest. Marcus produced detailed topographical maps of the surrounding area, spreading them across his dining table, while Elena studied the terrain with tactical eyes. "They'll come from the south," she said, tracing possible approach routes with her finger. "It's the only direction that offers decent vehicle access, and David prefers to maintain mobility options until the last possible moment." "What's his preferred operational method?" "Overwhelming force applied quickly." David doesn't believe in subtle approaches when he can simply overpower opposition. Elena marked several locations on the map. He'll want to establish a perimeter here, here, and here, then advance on the cabin with superior numbers and firepower. Marcus studied her markings, noting how they corresponded to natural choke points and defensible positions. You've thought about this before. I've been planning escape scenarios for months. Part of that meant understanding how David would respond to various situations. Elena's voice carried a note of grim satisfaction. He's tactically competent, but predictable. He relies on intimidation and superior resources rather than innovative thinking. Good, predictable enemies make mistakes. They spent the next several hours fortifying the cabin's defenses. Marcus revealed modifications he'd made during construction, including reinforced window frames designed to support protective barriers and hidden weapon caches, positioned throughout the structure. Elena assisted with mechanical precision, her detraining providing insight into criminal methodologies that complemented Marcus's military expertise. You know, Elena said while helping Marcus install steel shutters over the main windows, when I crawled through that snow yesterday, I thought I was just looking for shelter. I never imagined I'd find a partner. Marcus paused in his work, meeting her gaze directly. Is that what this is? Partnership? What else would you call it? Two professionals working together toward a common objective, each contributing specialized skills to achieve mission success. Elena's tone was matter-of-fact, but there was something deeper in her expression. Though I have to admit, it's been a long time since I worked with someone I could trust completely. Trust has to be earned. You earned it when you carried me out of that storm without asking what I'd done to deserve being beaten half to death. Elena resumed her work on the shutters. Most people assume victims must have done something to provoke their treatment. You just saw someone who needed help and provided it. As afternoon faded toward evening, Marcus prepared a meal while Elena continued studying the tactical situation. She'd moved beyond basic defensive planning to more complex scenarios involving pursuit, evasion, and potential counterattack operations. Marcus, she said without looking up from the maps, what's your endgame here? Are we just trying to survive David's first assault, or are we planning to end this permanently? The question hung in the air between them, forcing both to confront the reality of their situation. David Martinez wasn't going to simply give up and disappear. As long as he remained free and operational, Elena would never be safe, and now Marcus had made himself a target as well. What do you think should happen to David Martinez? Marcus asked carefully. Elena set down her pencil and looked directly at him. I think David Martinez is a cancer that has been metastasizing through the criminal justice system for years. He's responsible for the deaths of federal agents, the corruption of law enforcement officials, and the trafficking of drugs that destroy communities. She paused, her voice growing harder. I think the world would be a better place without him. In it, Marcus nodded slowly. Then we plan for permanent resolution. You understand what that means? There's no going back from a decision like that. Elena, I've made decisions like that before. The only difference is this time I'm choosing my own mission instead of following orders. Marcus joined her at the table, studying the maps with a new purpose. David Martinez declared war on you the moment he decided to hold you prisoner. All we're doing is accepting the terms of engagement he established. Elena felt something shift. Inside her chest, a loosening of tension she'd carried, for so long it had become part of her baseline existence. For the first time in months, she wasn't facing her enemies alone. Marcus wasn't just offering temporary shelter. He was committing to see this through to whatever end it required. There's something else you need to know, she said quietly. About the compound, about David's operations. He's not just laundering money for Mexican cartels. He's also running a human trafficking network, moving women and children through a route that stretches from Central America to major cities across the United States. Marcus felt familiar rage building in his chest, the same fury that had driven some of his most decisive actions during his military career. How many victims? Dozens at any given time. Maybe hundreds over the course of a year. Elena's voice remained steady, but Marcus could see the cost of that control. David showed me some of the facilities during our marriage, claiming it was just another business interest. Young women who disappear without a trace. Children who never get reported missing because their families are threatened into silence. And you couldn't do anything about it because of the threats against your sister. I gathered what evidence I could, but David was always careful to keep me isolated from operational details. Elena's hands clenched into fists. I've been carrying the knowledge of those crimes for months, knowing that every day I remained silent, more people suffered. Marcus reached across the table and covered one of her fists with his hand. That ends now. When we take down David's operation, we document everything. Every victim, every facility, every person involved gets exposed. Elena looked down at their joined hands, surprised by how natural the contact felt. Physical touch had become associated with pain and control for so long that she'd forgotten it could also represent comfort and support. Are you always this decisive about risking your life for strangers? She asked. You're not a stranger anymore. Marcus squeezed her hand gently before releasing it. And I stopped thinking of this as just helping you escape, David. Now it's about stopping a criminal organization that's destroying innocent lives. As darkness fell outside the cabin, they finalized their defensive preparations. Marcus had transformed his peaceful retreat into a fortress capable of withstanding sustained assault, while Elena had provided intelligence that would allow them to anticipate and counter David's tactical approaches. Contact from the south, Elena announced, monitoring a motion sensor display Marcus had discreetly installed. 3 vehicles moving slowly up the main access road. Marcus checked his watch. Earlier than expected. David must be more concerned about losing you than you thought. Or he's angrier than I calculated. Elena moved to a reinforced window, using binoculars to study the approaching vehicles. Black SUV in the lead, 2 pickup trucks following. I count at least 8 personnel, possibly more. Recognition, anyone? The lead SUV is David's personal vehicle. Armored glass, run-flat tires, probably has communications equipment that would make the FBI jealous. Elena adjusted the binoculars. Focus. The man in the passenger seat is Carlos Martinez, David's brother. Military background, served with distinction until he was discharged for excessive violence during interrogations. Marcus took position at a second observation point, studying the approaching convoy through his own optics. They're stopping about 400 yards out, just outside effective rifle range. David's being cautious. He'll want to assess the situation before committing to a direct assault. Elena lowered her binoculars. This is probably a negotiation attempt first. As if summoned by her words, Marcus's satellite phone began ringing. He looked at Elena, who nodded grimly. David Martinez, she mouthed. Marcus answered on the third. Ring. Sullivan, Mr. Sullivan, my name is David Martinez. I believe you have something that belongs to me. The voice was cultured, educated, with just a trace of accent that suggested careful elocution training. I don't have anything that belongs to you, Martinez. I think you do. My wife Elena wandered away from our home during the storm yesterday. She's not well, suffers from delusions and episodes of self-harm. I'm very concerned about her mental state. Marcus looked at Elena, who was shaking her head with disgust at David's manipulation tactics. I haven't seen your wife, Marcus lied smoothly. Mr. Sullivan, I appreciate your desire to protect someone you perceive as vulnerable, but Elena is very sick. She needs medical attention that only I can provide. If you're harboring her, you're actually putting her life at risk. And if I were harboring a sick woman, what would you propose? Simply allow me to collect her and return her to proper medical care. In exchange, I'm prepared to offer substantial compensation for your trouble, along with my gratitude for keeping her safe. Marcus met Elena's eyes, seeing cold fury there that matched his own growing anger at David's psychological manipulation. And if I refuse, David's tone shifted subtly, silk giving way to steel. Then I would be forced to involve local law enforcement in a search for a missing person. I'm sure they would be very thorough in their investigation of anyone who might have interfered with their efforts to locate Elena. The threat was clear and sophisticated. David was offering Marcus the choice between cooperation and legal complications that could destroy his carefully constructed life. "I'll need some time to consider your offer," Marcus said. "Of course. But please don't take too long. Elena's condition deteriorates rapidly without proper medication, and I would hate for anything unfortunate to happen while you're making your decision." The line went dead, leaving Marcus and Elena staring at each other in the sudden silence. "Medication?" Marcus asked. "Antipsychotics and mood stabilizers that David forced me to take to keep me compliant. I've been off them for 3 days now, which means I'm thinking clearly for the first time in months." Elena's voice carried bitter satisfaction. "David's used to dealing with a drugged, confused version of me. He has no idea what he's actually facing now." Marcus moved to the window, studying the static convoy in the distance. "How long will he wait for an answer?" "Not long. David's patient when it serves his purposes, but he hates being in situations he doesn't completely control." Elena joined him at the observation post. "I guess we have maybe 30 minutes before he decides negotiation has failed. Then we use that time to get into position." As they made final preparations for the coming battle, Elena caught Marcus's arm. "Whatever happens tonight," she said quietly, "I want you to know that finding you saved more than just my life. It gave me back my purpose." Marcus looked down at her battered but determined face, seeing strength that transcended physical healing. "Same here. I'd forgotten what it felt like to fight for something that actually mattered." Outside the Montana, night was clear and cold, stars visible in numbers that city dwellers never experienced. In 30 minutes, that peaceful darkness would explode into violence that would determine whether justice or corruption prevailed in this remote corner of the wilderness. Elena, Rodriguez, and Marcus Sullivan were ready. 20-7 minutes after David's phone call ended, the first shots shattered the mountain silence. Marcus had been expecting the sniper fire, positioned as he was behind reinforced barriers that he'd strategically placed months earlier. The bullets struck the cabin's walls with metallic pings, searching for weak points that didn't exist. "Suppressive fire from the tree line," Elena reported from her position at the rear window. "2 shooters, maybe 3, trying to keep us pinned while the main force moves up." Marcus peered through a carefully positioned mirror that allowed him to observe the front approach without exposing himself. "David's being more aggressive than you predicted. He's not bothering with a gradual escalation." "He's angry," Elena replied, adjusting her grip on the rifle Marcus had given her. "David doesn't handle rejection well, and your refusal to hand me over probably triggered his narcissistic rage. He's not thinking tactically anymore. He's thinking emotionally." That emotional thinking was about to cost David Martinez dearly. Marcus had spent 5 years preparing for exactly this scenario, though he'd always imagined the attackers would be government agents coming to drag him back into a world he'd rejected. The defensive systems he'd installed were military-grade, designed by someone who understood both assault tactics and the terrain advantages his position offered. The cabin sat on a natural rise that provided excellent fields of fire in all directions, with the only viable approach routes funneling attackers through predetermined kill zones. Marcus had cleared specific sectors of trees to create overlapping fields of fire while leaving others intact to provide natural barriers that would channel enemy movement exactly where he wanted it. "Movement on the eastern flank," Elena called out. 2 men attempting to work around to our blind spot." No blind spots, Marcus replied calmly, activating a remote sensor cluster he'd positioned in that exact location months earlier. Motion detectors linked to automated flares. Anyone who gets within 50 yards of that position is going to be illuminated like a Christmas tree. As if summoned by his words, brilliant white light suddenly flooded the eastern approach as the concealed flares ignited. 2 men who had been moving stealthily through the forest were suddenly exposed, caught in the open with nowhere to hide. They immediately dropped prone, but it was too late. Elena's rifle cracked twice in rapid succession. The first man clutched his shoulder and rolled behind a fallen log. The second man didn't move again. 1 down, 1 wounded, she reported with professional detachment. The wounded one is Carlos Martinez. He's still mobile, but his shooting arm is compromised. Marcus felt a moment of surprise at Elena's marksmanship. Making accurate shots at night, at distance, while injured, required exceptional skill. Then he remembered that D agents who worked undercover operations received the same advanced weapons training as military special operations personnel. How many more are we dealing with? Marcus asked, scanning the southern approach where the main assault would come. David brought at least 8 men, probably 10. Carlos is wounded, 1 is dead, which leaves 6 to 8 still operational. Elena reloaded smoothly, ejecting the spent magazine and sliding a fresh one home with practiced efficiency. But David's not going to sacrifice all his people for this. If we inflict enough casualties quickly enough, he'll withdraw and try a different approach. What kind of different approach? Fire, Elena said grimly. If David can't take me alive, he'll burn us out and claim we died accidentally in a cabin fire during a rescue attempt gone wrong. Marcus considered this possibility, which he'd already planned for during his defensive preparations. Let him try. This cabin has a sophisticated fire suppression system, and there are tunnels that lead to predetermined rally points if we need to evacuate under pressure. Tunnels? 5 years of planning, Elena. I told you I don't have just one of anything important. The next phase of the assault came from 3 directions simultaneously. David had adapted to the reality that Marcus's position was better defended than anticipated, deploying his remaining personnel in a coordinated attack designed to overwhelm. The defenders, through sheer volume of fire, automatic weapons opened up from the forest, sending hundreds of rounds toward the cabin in sustained bursts. The sound was deafening, a continuous roar of gunfire that would have terrorized civilians, but only increased Marcus's focus. "This is covering fire for a direct assault," he shouted over the noise. "They're going to rush the front entrance while we're suppressed." Elena had moved to a position that allowed her to cover the rear approach while still maintaining visual contact with Marcus. "I see them." 4 men moving up the main trail, using the gunfire to mask their approach. Marcus triggered a series of concealed explosive charges he'd buried along the primary attack route. The explosions lit up the night sky, sending snow and debris cascading through the forest. When the smoke cleared, only one of the 4 attackers was still moving, dragging himself away from the devastation with obvious leg injuries. "Claymore mines?" Elena asked. "Improvised explosive devices made from materials you can buy at any hardware store," Marcus replied. "Perfectly legal for property defense in Montana." The sustained gunfire abruptly ceased, leaving the mountain night eerily quiet except for the ringing in their ears. Marcus knew this was the most dangerous moment. Silence meant David was regrouping, probably planning something more sophisticated than direct assault. "Elena," Marcus said quietly, "I need you to listen carefully. David's about to try something that requires us to separate. I'm going to create a diversion that draws his attention away from the cabin, giving you an opportunity to escape through the tunnel system." "Absolutely not." Elena's response was immediate and firm. "We're partners, remember? Partners don't abandon each other when things get difficult. This isn't abandonment. It's tactics." If David captures both of us, we lose any chance of exposing his criminal network. Marcus moved to a weapons cache he'd concealed behind a false wall. But if you escape, you can contact federal agencies with the evidence we've gathered. Marcus, look at me. Elena's voice carried an authority that made him turn to face her directly. David Martinez has spent 8 months convincing me that I'm worthless, that I'm disposable, that my only value comes from my usefulness to him. I will not let you sacrifice yourself to prove his point. Marcus saw something in Elena's expression that went beyond tactical disagreement. This was about more than mission success. It was about her reclaiming her sense of self-worth after months of psychological destruction. Then we find a third option, he said finally. Elena nodded, moving back to her observation position. David's pulling back to the tree line. He's probably calling for reinforcements or planning to wait us out until daylight gives him tactical advantages. How long before reinforcements could arrive? Depends on who he calls. If it's a local muscle, maybe 2 hours. If he contacts his cartel connections, they could have a helicopter here by dawn with enough personnel to turn this into a genuine siege. Marcus considered their options, running through scenarios in his mind with the systematic approach that had kept him alive through multiple combat deployments. They had perhaps 6 hours before David's tactical position became insurmountable, which meant any offensive action had to happen soon. Elena, what do you know about David's communications equipment? He's got military-grade radio systems in all his vehicles, plus satellite phones and encrypted cellular devices. Why? Because if we can disrupt his communications, we isolate him from reinforcements and force him to operate with only the personnel he brought tonight. Marcus moved to another concealed cache, this one containing electronic warfare equipment that most civilians would never have access to. I've got jammers that can block everything from cell signals to satellite communications within a 5-mile radius. Elena felt hope stirring for the first time since the assault began. If David can't call for help, and if we've already reduced his operational strength by at least 30%, he becomes vulnerable to counterattack. Exactly. The question is whether you're physically capable of participating in an active assault operation. Elena tested her range of motion, stretching carefully and assessing her pain levels. The adrenaline of combat had temporarily suppressed much of the discomfort from her injuries, but she knew that wouldn't last indefinitely. I can function for several more hours if necessary, she said. My shooting accuracy isn't compromised, and I can move tactically as long as we're not talking about extended running or climbing. Marcus activated the communication jamming equipment. Watching indicator lights confirmed that all electronic signals in the area were now being disrupted. David's going to realize what happened within minutes. He'll probably send someone to investigate the source of the jamming, which creates an opportunity for us to take prisoners, Elena added. Someone who might have information about David's broader operations. They didn't have to wait long. Within 10 minutes of the jamming activation, Marcus's motion sensors detected 2 figures moving carefully toward the cabin from the northwest, the direction where he'd concealed the electronic warfare equipment. 2 men moving with tactical discipline, Marcus reported. They're probably David's most competent operators. Perfect. If we can capture one of them alive, we might learn enough about David's network to bring down the entire organization. Elena checked her equipment, ensuring she had restraints and medical supplies readily available. What's the plan? Marcus studied the approaching figures through his night vision equipment, noting their movement patterns and spacing. We let them find the jamming equipment, then take them when they're focused on disabling it. Non-lethal takedown if possible, but we prioritize our own safety. Elena nodded, moving to a position that would allow her to cover Marcus's approach while remaining concealed herself. On your signal. Marcus slipped out through a concealed exit that emerged from the cabin's basement, moving through the forest with the same silent efficiency that had made him legendary among special operations communities. The two men approaching the jamming equipment were competent, but not exceptional. Their attention focused on the technical equipment rather than perimeter security. Elena watched through her scope as Marcus positioned himself behind the lead attacker, waiting for the optimal moment to strike. The second man was kneeling beside the jamming device, examining it with a flashlight that destroyed his night vision. Marcus moved like a shadow, his arm wrapping around the first man's throat in a sleeper hold that rendered him unconscious within seconds. Elena simultaneously targeted the second man with a tranquilizer dart Marcus had provided, a non-lethal alternative that would incapacitate without permanent harm. Both attackers were unconscious within 30 seconds, leaving Marcus and Elena in possession of two prisoners and a wealth of intelligence opportunities. "Zip-tie their hands and feet," Marcus instructed as they dragged the unconscious men to a concealed position. "When they wake up, we're going to have some very important questions." As they secured their prisoners, Elena noticed something that made her blood run cold. The second man, the one she'd tranquilized, wore a pendant around his neck that she recognized immediately. "Marcus," she said quietly, "this man isn't one of David's regular operators. This pendant marks him as a member of Los Hermanos de la Muerte, a cartel enforcement unit responsible for some of the most brutal murders in Mexico." Marcus felt the tactical situation shifting in his mind. David Martinez wasn't just a criminal with local connections. He was directly affiliated with international organizations that had resources and capabilities far beyond what they'd anticipated. How much backup could a cartel enforcement unit provide? "Unlimited," Elena replied grimly. "If David has called in cartel muscle, we're not just facing a rescue operation anymore. We're facing a military-style assault by people who have government-level resources and absolutely no restrictions on their methods." As if summoned by her words, the distant sound of helicopter rotors began echoing through the mountain night. Multiple aircraft, approaching from the south, carrying unknown numbers of personnel who would be equipped and trained for exactly this type of operation. Marcus looked at Elena, seeing his own recognition reflected in her eyes. They had perhaps 20 minutes before their defensive position became completely untenable. "Time for that third option," Elena said, checking her weapons and equipment with renewed urgency. Marcus nodded, moving toward the tunnel entrance that would allow them to escape the cabin before it became a trap. But instead of retreat, he was planning something far more aggressive. "Elena," he said as they prepared to abandon their defensive position, "how would you feel about taking this fight directly to David Martinez, instead of waiting for him to bring it to us?" Elena's smile was sharp and cold, the expression of someone who had finally found an opportunity for justice after months of injustice. "I thought you'd never ask." The hunt was about to become a counter-hunt, and David Martinez was about to discover that his prey had transformed into predators. The tunnel system beneath Marcus's cabin had taken 2 years to complete, carved from solid rock with patience and precision that would have impressed military engineers. Elena followed him through passages that were tall enough to move through quickly, but narrow enough to prevent multiple attackers from advancing side by side. "Where does this lead?" she asked, noting the professional construction and ventilation systems that kept the air fresh despite being underground. "Emergency Rally Point Alpha, about 800 yards northeast of here," Marcus replied, navigating the tunnel with the confidence of someone who had walked this route countless times in complete darkness. "It's positioned to give us tactical advantage over anyone approaching the cabin from the south." The helicopter sounds grew louder as they moved, multiple aircraft circling the area like mechanical vultures. Elena counted at least 3 distinct rotor signatures, which meant David had called in serious reinforcements. The small-scale assault had escalated into a full military operation. They emerged from the tunnel through a concealed hatch built into what appeared to be a natural rock formation. The rally point was a masterpiece of camouflaged engineering. invisible from any angle unless you knew exactly what to look for. Marcus had created a fortified observation post with clear sight lines back toward his cabin and the surrounding. Approaches. Jesus, Alina whispered, studying the view through Marcus's high-powered optics. David brought an army. 3 helicopters had landed in the clearing below, disgorging personnel and tactical gear that looked more like military special operations than civilian security. Alina counted at least 20 new arrivals, all armed with automatic weapons and moving with the disciplined precision of professional soldiers. Cartel military unit, she confirmed, recognizing the equipment and tactics. These aren't just enforcers. They're ex-military personnel who've been recruited by Los Hermanos de la Muerte, specifically for operations like this. Marcus studied the tactical situation with growing concern. 20-plus professional soldiers, air support, and unlimited ammunition changed everything about their defensive prospects. The cabin that had seemed impregnable an hour earlier would be overrun within minutes once this force organized itself properly. David, standing beside the lead helicopter, Alina observed, adjusting the scope's magnification. And he's talking to someone I don't recognize. Tall man, expensive suit, definitely not dressed for combat operations. Marcus took the binoculars, focusing on the figure Alina had indicated. The man was indeed out of place among the military personnel, his bearing suggesting authority rather than combat experience. Any idea who that could be? Could be cartel leadership, but more likely it's someone from David's legitimate business connections. Someone with enough influence to arrange helicopter transport and military personnel without questions being asked. Alina's voice carried a growing alarm. Marcus, if David has brought in outside authority figures, this situation is about to become much more complicated. As if summoned by her words, Marcus's satellite phone began ringing despite the communication jamming they'd activated. The only way the call could be getting through was if it was being transmitted on frequencies that bypassed his jamming equipment entirely. Government frequencies, Marcus realized, looking at the caller ID display. Someone with federal-level access to secure communication systems. Alina felt ice forming in her stomach. Don't answer it. Whatever they're about to offer you, it's designed to get us to surrender peacefully. But Marcus was already answering, his expression grim with recognition of the tactical implications. Sullivan, he said simply. Mr. Sullivan, this is Deputy Director James Crawford with the Department of Justice. I'm calling to inform you that you're currently interfering with a federal operation authorized under the Patriot Act. The voice was professional, authoritative, and completely confident in its authority. Marcus met Elena's eyes, seeing his own understanding reflected there. David Martinez had somehow managed to frame their situation as a federal law enforcement operation, which meant any resistance they offered would be classified as domestic terrorism. What federal operation? Marcus asked. The recovery of Elena Rodriguez, a federal witness whose testimony is crucial to an ongoing investigation into drug trafficking organizations. Ms. Rodriguez suffered a psychological breakdown and disappeared from protective custody. Mr. David Martinez has been assisting our efforts to locate her safely. Elena shook her head violently, mouthing lies while gesturing toward the military force below. But Marcus understood the sophisticated nature of the trap David had constructed. By involving federal authorities and framing Elena as an unstable witness rather than an abuse victim, David had created a situation where any resistance would be met with overwhelming legal and physical force. Deputy Director Crawford, Marcus said carefully, I'd like to speak with Elena Rodriguez before making any decisions about cooperation. That's not possible, Mr. Sullivan. Ms. Rodriguez is experiencing severe psychological distress and is not competent to make rational decisions about her own safety. The kindest thing you can do is allow medical professionals to provide the care she needs. Elena grabbed the phone from Marcus's hand, her voice cutting through the conversation with ice-cold authority. "Deputy Director Crawford, this is special. Agent Elena Rodriguez, D badge number 47,291. I am not experiencing psychological distress. I am not in protective custody, and David Martinez is not assisting any federal operation. He is a target of investigation for money laundering, human trafficking, and the murder of federal agents." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for long seconds before Crawford responded, his tone noticeably less confident. "Agent Rodriguez, our records indicate that you were relieved of duty 8 months ago due to reliability concerns and potential compromise by criminal organizations." "Your records are falsified," Elena replied flatly. "David Martinez has been manipulating federal databases to support a cover story that allows him to operate without interference. I have evidence of his criminal activities and the corruption of law enforcement officials that has enabled his operations. Agent Rodriguez, you're making very serious accusations without providing any substantive proof." Elena looked at Marcus, who nodded and activated a digital recorder connected to their communication system. "Deputy Director Crawford, I'm transmitting documented evidence right now. Financial records showing payment from cartel sources to law enforcement accounts, photographs of trafficking victims at Martinez facilities, and communication intercepts proving coordination between Martinez and Los Hermanos de la Muerte leadership." Marcus was simultaneously uploading files to multiple federal agencies, news organizations, and congressional oversight committees. The evidence Elena had gathered during her months of captivity was being distributed to dozens of recipients who would be legally obligated to investigate regardless of any political pressure to ignore it. "Furthermore," Elena continued, "I'm formally requesting immediate federal protection while testifying about Martinez's criminal activities and the corruption that has enabled them. Any attempt to return me to Martinez's custody will constitute obstruction of justice and conspiracy to commit murder." Crawford's response came after another long pause, his authority clearly shaken by Elena's professional competence and the evidence being transmitted. "Agent Rodriguez, these are extremely serious allegations. I'll need to verify your claims through appropriate channels before proceeding. You have 30 minutes, Elena replied. "After that, I'm contacting every major news organization in the country with a story about federal agencies being manipulated by cartel money to facilitate human trafficking operations." She ended the call and looked at Marcus with grim satisfaction. "That should buy us some time while federal agencies try to figure out what's actually happening here." Marcus was studying the activity below through his optics, noting increased communication between the helicopter crews and growing agitation among the tactical personnel. "David's getting new orders," he observed, "and he doesn't look happy about them." Indeed, David Martinez appeared to be arguing with the well-dressed man beside the helicopter, gesturing angrily toward the cabin and making increasingly emphatic points. The conversation ended with David stalking away from the helicopter, clearly frustrated by whatever instructions he'd received. "Federal oversight is complicating David's plans," Elena said with satisfaction. "He was counting on being able to claim government authority for whatever he planned to do to us. Now he has to worry about actual federal agencies investigating his story." But their relief was short-lived. Marcus noticed movement among the tactical personnel that suggested preparation for immediate action rather than withdrawal. "Elena, they're not standing down. If anything, they're accelerating their timeline." Elena refocused her binoculars on the activity below, her expression darkening as she recognized the tactical preparations taking place. "David's decided to cut his losses. He's going to eliminate both of us and claim we died resisting arrest during a federal operation." She looked at Marcus with growing urgency. "We have maybe 10 minutes before they launch a final assault designed to leave no survivors." Marcus was already moving, gathering equipment from the concealed caches he'd positioned throughout the rally. Point. Then we don't give them the chance to execute that plan. What are you thinking? Direct action against David Martinez himself. If we can take him alive, we can force a standoff that requires actual federal involvement instead of this manufactured crisis. Marcus handed Elena a tactical pack loaded with specialized equipment. But it means going on the offensive against superior numbers and terrain that favors them. Elena accepted the pack, checking its contents with professional interest. Smoke grenades, flashbangs, climbing gear, and enough ammunition for an extended firefight. Marcus, you understand that once we leave this position, we're committed to either complete success or death. There's no middle ground with an operation like this. I understand. But Elena, David Martinez has been destroying lives for years while hiding behind corruption and intimidation. Tonight, that ends. Elena felt something shifting inside her chest, a sense of purpose that had been missing since David had destroyed her career and trapped her in captivity. For the first time in months, she wasn't just surviving or escaping. She was actively fighting back against the forces that had tried to break her. How do we get close enough to take David alive without getting killed by his security force? Marcus smiled grimly, pointing toward a route that would take them around the eastern flank of the landing zone. Remember those tunnels I mentioned? This installation has more than just one exit. 20 minutes later, they emerged from a concealed entrance less than 50 yards from where David Martinez stood arguing with his cartel contacts. The noise of helicopter engines and tactical radio chatter had masked their approach perfectly, and the overwhelming focus on the cabin assault had drawn attention away from perimeter security. Elena could see David clearly now, recognizing the expensive clothing and arrogant bearing that had once charmed her into believing he was different from his criminal family. Now she saw him for what he really was, a predator who used charm and manipulation to destroy anyone who threatened his sense of control. Remember, Marcus whispered, we need him alive and talking. Dead martyrs don't expose criminal networks. Elena nodded, checking her weapon and mentally preparing for what might be her final confrontation with the man who had nearly destroyed her life. Marcus, she said quietly, whatever happens in the next few minutes, I want you to know that working with you has reminded me who I used to be before David tried to break me. Marcus looked at her, seeing not the broken victim he'd pulled from the snow, but a federal agent preparing to complete her mission, despite impossible odds. Elena, you were never broken. You were just waiting for the right moment to fight back. They moved forward together, two professionals united by purpose and refined by adversity, ready to bring justice to a man who had believed himself untouchable. David Martinez was about to discover that some people couldn't be bought, intimidated, or destroyed, and that justice delayed was not justice denied. The flashbang grenade detonated directly behind David Martinez, its blinding light and deafening concussion dropping him to his knees while simultaneously disorienting the three cartel soldiers standing nearby. Marcus and Elena moved through the chaos with surgical precision, their weeks of planning condensed into 30 seconds of flawless execution. Elena reached David first, pressing her pistol against the base of his skull while Marcus neutralized the closest guard with a combination of martial arts techniques that left the man unconscious but breathing. The remaining two soldiers raised their weapons but found themselves facing Elena's unwavering aim and Marcus's rifle trained on their center mass. "Drop your weapons," Elena commanded in Spanish, her voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who had faced death and chosen to fight back. "Your employer is now a federal prisoner." David Martinez struggled to focus through the effects of the flashbang, his expensive suit torn and his carefully maintained composure shattered. When his vision cleared enough to recognize Elena's face, his expression shifted from confusion to rage to something approaching fear. "You can't do this," he gasped, blood trickling from his nose where he'd fallen face first into the gravel. "I have federal protection. These men have diplomatic immunity. Really?" Elena smiled coldly, keeping her weapon trained on David while Marcus secured the surrendering guards. "Because according to the phone call I just had with Deputy Director Crawford, the Department of Justice has no record of any operation involving you. In fact, they're very interested in investigating how someone managed to fake federal authorization for a military-style assault." Marcus zip-tied the guards' hands behind their backs, noting that neither man seemed particularly loyal to David when faced with federal charges. Cartel soldiers were professionals who understood when a situation had become untenable, and smart enough not to compound their legal problems with futile resistance. "David Martinez," Elena continued, her voice gaining strength with each word, "you are under citizen's arrest for kidnapping, assault, human trafficking, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit murder. You have the right to remain silent, though I suspect you're going to want to start talking very soon." David's eyes darted toward the helicopters, where the remaining cartel personnel were realizing that their leadership had been captured. Several were already moving toward the aircraft, clearly preparing to evacuate rather than attempt a rescue that would only increase their legal exposure. "They're abandoning you, David," Marcus observed, watching the tactical withdrawal through his scope. "Funny how loyalty disappears when people realize they're working for someone who can't protect them anymore." Elena heard the helicopters spinning up their rotors, preparing for immediate departure. The cartel soldiers were cutting their losses, unwilling to risk capture for someone who had clearly lost control of the situation. Within minutes, David Martinez would be alone with the two people he had tried to destroy. "This isn't over," David snarled, struggling against his restraints. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. I have connections that reach into every level of government. I have resources you can't imagine." "Had," Elena corrected. Past tense, David. Because right now, federal agents are executing search warrants on every property you own, freezing every bank account connected to your operations, and arresting every corrupt official who's been taking your money. David's face went pale as he realized the implications of what Elena was saying. "That's impossible. You've been my prisoner for 8 months. You couldn't have gathered that kind of evidence." Elena reached into her tactical pack and withdrew a small digital recorder that had been concealed in the lining of the clothes David had forced her to wear during captivity. "Actually, David, I've been gathering evidence every single day. Every conversation, every meeting, every phone call. All recorded and automatically uploaded to secure servers that you never knew existed." The look of absolute shock on David's face was worth every moment of suffering Elena had endured during her captivity. He had been so confident in his control, so certain that his psychological manipulation had broken her completely, that he had never suspected she was methodically documenting his criminal activities. "You see," Elena continued, kneeling down to meet David's eyes directly, "I never stopped being a federal agent. I just let you think you'd turn me into a victim. Every time you showed me your facilities, every time you bragged about your connections, every time you threatened my family, I was building the case that's going to destroy everything you've built." Marcus monitored the approaching sirens that indicated genuine federal agents were finally arriving at the scene. The evidence Elena had transmitted had triggered immediate responses from multiple agencies, and the small army of law enforcement vehicles climbing the mountain road suggested that David Martinez's criminal empire was about to face the full weight of the federal justice system. "Elena," Marcus said quietly, "we've got FBI, DN, U.S. Marshals about 2 minutes out, plus what looks like a federal prosecutor and enough evidence technicians to process a major crime scene." Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in months: complete vindication. Not just personal justice, but professional satisfaction at seeing a major criminal organization exposed and dismantled through patient investigative work. "David," she said, standing and holstering her weapon. "I want you to understand something. Very clearly. Every woman you trafficked, every family you destroyed, every agent you had killed, they all get justice today. Not because of luck or chance, but because you made the mistake of underestimating someone you thought you'd broken." The first federal vehicles crested the ridge as the last cartel helicopter disappeared into the distance. FBI agents emerged, with weapons drawn, quickly establishing a secure perimeter while DEA supervisors moved to take custody of David Martinez and his remaining associates. Agent Rodriguez called a woman in a federal windbreaker, approaching with credentials extended. "Assistant Director Sarah Mitchell, D. We need to debrief you immediately and get you medical attention." Elena accepted the credentials, noting that Mitchell was someone she recognized from interagency briefings before her undercover assignment had gone so disastrously wrong. "Assistant Director, I'm physically functional and ready to provide a complete briefing on Martinez's criminal organization. But first, I need to introduce you to Marcus Sullivan, without whom none of this would have been possible." Marcus found himself surrounded by federal agents who were treating him with the cautious respect typically reserved for someone whose background required security clearance to discuss. His military records, it seemed, had preceded him into this situation. "Mr. Sullivan," Assistant Director Mitchell said, "from what we understand, you provided crucial assistance to Agent Rodriguez during a very dangerous situation. The Bureau will want a complete statement, but I want you to know that your actions probably saved not just Agent Rodriguez's life, but potentially dozens of trafficking victims." As federal evidence technicians began processing the scene, David Martinez was loaded into a heavily armored transport vehicle. Elena found herself alone with Marcus for the first time since their desperate escape from the cabin. "So," Marcus said, looking out over the forest that had been transformed into a major crime scene, "what happens now?" Elena considered the question, thinking about the months of testimony and legal proceedings that lay ahead, the trafficking victims who would finally receive justice, and the corrupt officials who would face prosecution for their crimes. "Now, the real work begins," she said finally. "David's arrest is just the beginning. We've identified a criminal network that spans multiple states and involves dozens of co-conspirators. It's going to take years to fully dismantle everything he built. And you'll be involved in that prosecution?" "As the primary witness and case agent, yes. I'll probably spend the next 2 years testifying in various courtrooms across the country." Elena paused, studying Marcus's expression. "But first, I'll need to recover from the injuries I sustained during my escape from Martinez's compound." Marcus smiled, understanding the implication in her carefully chosen words. "Recovery time sounds important. Mountain air is supposed to be very therapeutic, so I've heard. And I imagine having someone with medical training and tactical skills nearby would be beneficial during the recovery process. I might know someone who fits that description." As federal agents completed their initial processing of the scene, Elena and Marcus found themselves walking back toward the cabin that had served as their fortress during the night's battle. The structure had sustained minor damage from gunfire, but Marcus's defensive preparations had proven remarkably effective. "Elena," Marcus said as they reached the front porch, "can I ask you something personal? After everything we've been through together, I think you've earned the right to ask personal questions. When you crawled through that snow yesterday, what were you thinking? What kept you moving when everything else was telling you to give up?" Elena considered the question seriously, remembering the desperation and determination that had driven her through the blizzard toward an uncertain fate. "I was thinking about all the women and children David was trafficking, and how they deserved someone who wouldn't give up on them," she said finally. "But mostly, I was thinking that I refused to die as a victim. If I was going to die, it would be as someone who had fought back." Marcus nodded, understanding the mindset that had driven Elena through impossible circumstances to find refuge at his door. And now? Elena looked at the cabin that had sheltered them, the man who had risked everything to help her, and the federal agents who were finally bringing justice to victims who had been forgotten by the system. Now I know that sometimes fighting back means more than just surviving. Sometimes it means finding people who will fight alongside you and discovering that you're stronger together than you ever were alone. As the sun rose over the Montana mountains, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and pink, Elena Rodriguez and Marcus Sullivan stood together on the porch of a cabin that had become the epicenter of justice for dozens of victims who had been waiting years for someone to remember their names. Behind them, federal agents processed evidence that would destroy a criminal empire. Ahead of them lay the long work of healing and rebuilding, both personally and professionally. But for the first time in months, Elena could envision a future that included something more than mere survival. "Marcus," she said quietly, "thank you for seeing me as someone worth saving." "Elena," he replied, "thank you for reminding me what it means to fight for something that matters." David Martinez's reign of terror had ended not with a dramatic shootout or political intervention, but with the quiet determination of two people who had refused to accept that justice was impossible. Their partnership, forged in desperation and refined by adversity, had proven that sometimes the most powerful weapon against evil was simply the refusal to surrender. The strongest partnerships, Elena realized, weren't built on convenience or comfort, but on shared purpose and mutual respect earned through trials that revealed the true character of those involved. She had crawled through snow as a victim seeking shelter, but had found something infinitely more valuable, a partner who saw her strength, even when she had forgotten it herself. As federal vehicles began the long journey down the mountain carrying David Martinez toward justice, Elena and Marcus remained on the porch, planning their next moves in a partnership that had transformed them both from isolated individuals into something far more powerful together than either had been alone. 6 months after that night in the Montana wilderness, Elena Rodriguez stood before a federal courthouse in Denver, adjusting her blazer as she prepared for what would be the final day of testimony in the largest human trafficking prosecution in U.S. history. The woman who had once crawled through snow in a torn nightgown now wore the confident bearing of someone who had reclaimed not just her life, but her purpose. The scars on her wrists had faded to thin white lines, barely visible unless someone knew to look for them. The bruises that had once mapped David Martinez's violence across her face were now just memories, replaced by the healthy glow of someone who had spent months healing in mountain air and honest sunlight. Marcus stood beside her on the courthouse steps, no longer the isolated hermit who had chosen exile over engagement with a broken world. His beard was trimmed shorter now, his clothing more suited to urban environments, but his eyes still held the same steady determination that had made him risk everything for a stranger in distress. "How are you feeling about today?" he asked, noting the slight tension in Elena's shoulders despite her outward composure. "Ready," she replied simply. David's sentencing is the end of one chapter, but also the beginning of everything else we've built since that night. Inside the courthouse, federal prosecutors presented evidence that had grown far beyond Elena's initial recordings. The investigation she had triggered by crawling through that blizzard had uncovered a criminal network spanning 7 states, involving 43 co-conspirators, and responsible for trafficking over 200 victims in just the past 3 years. David Martinez sat at the defendant's table wearing an orange jumpsuit that was a far cry from his expensive suits, his once arrogant bearing replaced by the hollow stare of someone who had watched his entire world collapse in slow motion. The cartel connections that had once protected him had abandoned him completely once his arrest triggered federal investigations that threatened their broader operations. "Your Honor," Elena said when called to provide her victim impact statement. David Martinez didn't just steal 8 months of my life. He stole the lives of women and children who trusted that someone, somewhere, would remember they existed and fight for their freedom. She had testified dozens of times over the past 6 months, but this final statement felt different. Not just professional testimony, but personal closure for someone who had transformed trauma into purpose. The night I escaped through that storm, I thought I was just trying to save myself. I had no idea that my survival would lead to justice for so many others. But that's what happens when good people refuse to look away from evil. That's what happens when someone like Marcus Sullivan chooses to see a fellow human being in need rather than a problem to be avoided. Elena's eyes found Marcus in the gallery, seeing the slight smile that crossed his face at her public acknowledgement of his role in everything that had followed. David Martinez believed that power came from controlling others, from breaking them down until they forgot their own worth. He was wrong. Real power comes from lifting others up, from partnerships built on mutual respect and shared purpose. It comes from people who choose to fight for justice even when the system has failed. Judge Catherine Brennan, a federal magistrate with 30 years of experience in criminal prosecutions, had presided over many trafficking cases but few that had exposed corruption at the level this one had revealed. "Mr. Martinez," she said, addressing the defendant directly, "your crimes represent not just individual acts of violence, but systematic corruption of the institutions designed to protect the innocent. You used wealth and connections to transform law enforcement agencies into instruments of your criminal enterprise." The judge's voice carried the weight of moral authority that came from decades of witnessing human nature, at its worst and occasionally at its best. "The evidence presented in this case demonstrates that you were responsible for crimes that destroyed dozens of families and corrupted multiple levels of government. The sentence I impose today reflects not just punishment for those crimes, but society's determination that such corruption will not be tolerated." David Martinez received 4 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole, plus an additional 150 years for related charges. His brother Carlos, who had been captured during the cabin assault, received 45 years. The corrupt sheriff's deputy, who had covered up Elena's initial attempts to seek help, received 25 years and the permanent loss of his law enforcement certification. But more importantly, the investigation had led to the rescue of 127 trafficking victims who were now receiving comprehensive support services, and the prosecution of a network that had operated with impunity for over a decade. As court adjourned and David Martinez was led away in shackles, Elena felt something she hadn't expected. Not satisfaction or vindication, but simple peace. The scared woman who had crawled through snow seeking only survival had become someone who had helped bring justice to people who had been forgotten by everyone else. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd of journalists waited for statements from the prosecution team. Elena had become something of a symbol during the lengthy legal proceedings, representing both the failure of institutions to protect victims and the possibility of redemption when good people chose to act. Agent Rodriguez called a reporter from the Denver Post. "How has this experience changed your perspective on law enforcement and the justice system?" Elena considered the question carefully, thinking about the corrupt officials who had enabled David's crimes and the dedicated agents who had worked tirelessly to expose them. "This case proved that institutions are only as strong as the people who comprise them," she replied. "When those people choose personal gain over public service, innocent people suffer. But when they choose to do what's right regardless of personal cost, justice becomes possible even in impossible circumstances. What's next for you professionally?" "I'm returning to active duty with the D, but with a new focus on training agents who work undercover operations. We're developing protocols that will make it much harder for criminals to manipulate federal databases and corrupt official records." Elena paused, glancing at Marcus. I'm also consulting on a new interagency task force that focuses on trafficking networks with government connections. Marcus stepped forward when a journalist asked about his role in the investigation. I did what anyone should do when they find someone in need, he said simply. The remarkable thing about this case isn't that I helped Elena escape. It's that she had the courage and skill to turn her survival into justice for so many others. A reporter from CNN pressed for more details about their partnership. Mr. Sullivan, you've essentially come out of retirement to work with federal agencies on similar cases. What motivated that decision? Marcus looked at Elena, seeing in her face the journey from victim to survivor, to someone who had chosen to dedicate her life to protecting others. I spent 5 years hiding from a world I thought was broken beyond repair, he said. Elena showed me that the world isn't broken. It's just waiting for people who are willing to do the hard work of fixing it. 3 hours later, Elena and Marcus sat in a quiet restaurant near the courthouse, sharing a meal and reflecting on the long journey that had brought them to this moment. The media attention was behind them, the legal proceedings finally concluded, and for the first time in months, they could simply be two people who had found something valuable in each other's company. So, Marcus said, raising his coffee cup, in a mock toast, what does a federal agent do for relaxation after bringing down an international criminal conspiracy? Elena smiled, feeling genuinely relaxed for the first time she could remember. Well, I've got 3 weeks of vacation time saved up, and I hear the Montana mountains are beautiful this time of year. I might know someone who could provide a tour guide service, professional rates, for you, family discount. The ease of their conversation reflected a partnership that had evolved far beyond the crisis that had brought them together. Elena had stayed at Marcus's cabin during her recovery, officially for security reasons, but actually, because both had discovered they preferred each other's company to solitude. Marcus had gradually returned to the world, beyond his mountain retreat, consulting with federal agencies on security matters and discovering that his skills could serve justice rather than just personal survival. Elena had provided a bridge between his military background and civilian law enforcement, helping him find purpose that didn't require complete isolation. Marcus, Elena said, suddenly serious, I need to ask you something important. Go ahead. When you carried me out of that storm, did you have any idea what you were getting yourself into? Marcus considered the question, thinking about the isolated hermit he had been and the man he had become through their partnership. Honestly? No. I thought I was just helping someone who needed medical attention. He paused, meeting her eyes directly. But if I had known, I would have made the same choice. Some things are worth the risk. Elena felt warmth spreading through her chest, a sense of belonging that had nothing to do with location and everything to do with finding someone who understood her completely. And now? Any regrets about leaving your hermit lifestyle behind? Only that it took me so long to realize that hiding from the world's problems doesn't make them go away. It just means you're not part of the solution, Marcus smiled. Plus, I discovered that the right partner makes even the most dangerous situations manageable. Their conversation was interrupted by Elena's phone buzzing with a text message from Assistant Director Mitchell. A new case had developed involving suspected trafficking operations near the Canadian border, and the Bureau was requesting Elena's specific expertise. Work calling? Marcus asked. Potentially. There's a situation in North Dakota that might require someone with experience in trafficking investigations. Elena showed him the message details. Remote location, possible government corruption. Victims who have been ignored by local authorities. Sounds familiar, very familiar. Mitchell wants to know if I'm interested in leading the investigation. Marcus studied Elena's expression, seeing the spark of professional interest that indicated her answer even before she spoke. Are you? Only if I can bring my own tactical consultant, Elena replied. Someone with experience in remote operations and a talent for creative problem solving. I might know someone who fits that description." Elena leaned back in her chair, looking at Marcus with appreciation that went far beyond professional respect. He had given her back her life when she was crawling through snow as a broken victim. Now he was offering to stand beside her as she used that life to protect others. "Marcus, are you sure you want to sign up for a career of chasing criminals across the country instead of peaceful mountain living?" "Elena, peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's knowing that you're fighting for something that matters." Marcus reached across the table and took her hand. "Besides, I've discovered that the right company makes any location feel like home." Outside the restaurant window, snow was beginning to fall in Denver, reminding both of them of the storm that had brought them together. But this snow felt different, peaceful rather than desperate, marking the change of seasons rather than the flight from danger. "You know," Elena said, watching the snowflakes drift past the window, 6 months ago I thought my story was ending. I was crawling through snow thinking about all the things I'd never get to do, all the people I'd never be able to help. And now I realize that was just the end of one chapter. Everything important was about to begin." Elena squeezed Marcus's hand. "Sometimes the worst moments in our lives are actually doorways to the best ones." Marcus nodded, understanding completely. His self-imposed exile had felt like an ending, but it had actually positioned him to become exactly the person Elena needed, when she needed him most. "So we're really doing this?" he asked, "becoming professional partners in addition to whatever else we are?" Elena's smile was radiant, carrying none of the caution that had marked her expressions for so many months. "Marcus Sullivan, I crawled through a blizzard to find you once. I'm not letting you get away now." As they left the restaurant and walked into the gently falling snow, Elena and Marcus looked like what they had become, two people who had found strength in each other that neither possessed alone. Their partnership had been forged in crisis, tested under fire, and proven strong enough to build a future on. The woman who had once been David Martinez's victim was now Special Agent Elena Rodriguez, leading federal investigations into crimes that had previously been ignored or covered up. The hermit who had hidden from the world's problems was now Marcus Sullivan, tactical consultant to federal agencies and partner to someone who had reminded him why justice mattered. Together, they were something more powerful than either had been individually, proof that sometimes the most broken circumstances can create the strongest bonds, and that real partnership means seeing someone's potential, even when they've forgotten it themselves. The snow continued to fall as they walked toward their hotel, but neither felt cold. They had each other, they had purpose, and they had learned that sometimes crawling through a storm leads not to shelter, but to home. Behind them, the courthouse stood as a monument to justice served and victims remembered. Ahead of them stretched endless possibilities for making the world safer for people who needed someone to fight for them. Elena Rodriguez had crawled through snow as a victim seeking refuge. She was walking away as a federal agent with a partner who would stand beside her no matter what storms lay ahead. Sometimes, the strongest partnerships begin with someone who sees you as worth saving, even when you've forgotten your own value. And sometimes, those partnerships become the foundation for transforming not just individual lives, but the world around them. In the end, David Martinez had been wrong about power. It didn't come from breaking people down or controlling them through fear. Real power came from lifting others up, from partnerships built on mutual respect and shared purpose, and from the choice to fight for justice, even when the system had failed. Elena and Marcus had learned that lesson in the crucible of crisis, and now they were ready to teach it to anyone who thought they could hide their crimes behind corruption and intimidation. The storm that had brought them together was over. The work they would do together was just beginning. 2 weeks later, Elena and Marcus found themselves driving through the remote landscape of North Dakota, heading toward what would become their first official case as partners, the suspected trafficking operation near the Canadian border, had already claimed the attention of multiple federal agencies, but local law enforcement had been strangely uncooperative. The pattern is almost identical to what we saw with David's network, Elena observed, reviewing case files as Marcus navigated the rural highways. Victims who disappear without investigation, law enforcement officials who refuse to pursue leads, and a sophisticated operation that seems to have inside knowledge of federal activities. Marcus studied the terrain around them, noting how the flat prairie offered excellent visibility, but few defensive positions if things went wrong. What kind of resistance are we expecting? Unknown, which is what makes this dangerous. We're going in without the kind of intelligence we had about David's operation. Elena closed the file folder and looked at Marcus seriously. Are you sure you're ready for this? Working one case from a defensive position in familiar territory is different from actively hunting criminals in hostile territory. Marcus smiled, the expression carrying confidence earned through trial by fire. Elena, 6 months ago, I was hiding in a cabin thinking the world's problems were too big for one person to make a difference. You taught me that one person can't solve everything, but two people working together can accomplish what seems impossible. Their destination was the small town of Millbrook, population 847, where 3 young women had disappeared over the past year without generating any meaningful law enforcement response. The local sheriff claimed the women were runaways, but family members had provided evidence suggesting something far more sinister. According to the case briefing, Elena said, all 3 victims were between 18 and 22, all had limited family connections, and all disappeared under circumstances that suggest they were specifically targeted. Classic trafficking victim profile, Marcus noted grimly. Vulnerable individuals with few people who would immediately notice their absence or have resources to investigate. As they entered Millbrook, both Elena and Marcus immediately noted signs that something was fundamentally wrong with the community. The town was too quiet for midday, with most businesses appearing closed despite posted hours indicating they should be open. The few people visible on the streets avoided eye contact and moved with the nervous energy of individuals living under some form of threat. This place feels like a war zone, Marcus observed, parking outside the sheriff's office. Population's been intimidated into silence. Elena had seen similar dynamics in communities where criminal organizations had established territorial control through strategic violence and corruption. Let's see how cooperative the local law enforcement is willing to be. Sheriff William Crane was a heavy-set man in his 50s whose office displayed the kind of fishing trophies and hunting photographs that suggested someone more interested in outdoor recreation than criminal investigation. His response to Elena's credentials and questions about the missing women was immediately defensive. Agent Rodriguez, I appreciate federal interest in our local affairs, but these cases have been thoroughly investigated, Crane said, his tone carrying the patronizing quality of someone who resented outside oversight. All 3 women were adults who chose to leave town for personal reasons. Sheriff Crane, Elena replied with professional courtesy that masked growing suspicion. The families have provided evidence that suggests these women were planning to remain in the area long term. Jobs they intended to keep, lease agreements they had recently signed, personal belongings they left behind. Families sometimes don't know as much about their relatives as they think they do, Crane responded dismissively. Young women make impulsive decisions about relationships and opportunities. It's not uncommon for them to leave without detailed explanations. Marcus, who had been quietly observing the sheriff's office, noted several details that raised additional concerns. Communications equipment that seemed far too sophisticated for a rural law enforcement agency. Surveillance monitors displaying feeds from locations throughout the town, and weapons storage that suggested preparation for military level conflict rather than typical police work. Sheriff, Marcus interjected, this is impressive equipment for a small town operation. Grant funding? Crane's expression tightened slightly. We've been fortunate to receive federal and state assistance for modernizing our capabilities. Rural communities face unique security challenges that require advanced resources. Elena and Marcus exchanged glances, both recognizing the pattern of excessive resources that often indicated criminal money flowing through official channels. We'd like to interview the families of the missing women, Elena said. Standard procedure. For federal review of local cases. I'm afraid that won't be possible today, Crane replied quickly. The families have been through enough trauma already. I'd need to arrange those meetings in advance to ensure they're emotionally prepared for additional questioning. Elena felt familiar warning signals, the same institutional resistance she had encountered when trying to investigate David Martinez's operations. Sheriff Crane, these families requested federal involvement. They specifically asked for someone to review cases they felt hadn't received adequate attention. Agent Rodriguez, I understand your desire to be thorough, but sometimes federal agents see conspiracies where local knowledge recognizes simpler explanations. Crane stood clearly, indicating the meeting was over. I'll contact you tomorrow about scheduling family interviews. In the meantime, I recommend you and your consultant stay at the motel on Highway 12. It's the only accommodation in town that meets federal security standards. Outside the sheriff's office, Elena and Marcus walked silently to their vehicle, both aware that they were likely being observed and possibly recorded. That was interesting, Marcus said once they were safely inside their car with the windows closed. That was a man who's hiding something significant, Elena replied. The question is whether he's directly involved in whatever happened to those women or just taking money to look the other way. They drove to the recommended motel, a surprisingly modern facility that seemed out of place in the economically depressed community. The desk clerk checked them in with efficiency that suggested familiarity with federal agents, asking no questions about their length of stay or purpose for visiting. Room 237, the clerk said, handing Elena electronic key cards. Continental. Breakfast is available from 6 to 10, and there's a business center if you need computer access. In their room, Elena and Marcus immediately began electronic sweeps for surveillance devices, a precaution that had become routine during their partnership. The room was clean, but Marcus noted that the motel security cameras covered every possible angle of approach and departure. We're being monitored, he confirmed, studying the camera placements through their window. Whoever's running this operation wants to know exactly who's asking questions and what they're doing. Elena spread the case files across the small table, studying photographs of the three missing women. Sarah Chun, 21, had been enrolled in community college and working part-time at a local diner. Maria Santos, 19, had recently started a job at the town's only grocery store. Jennifer Walsh, 22, had been living with her grandmother while saving money to attend nursing school. All three women had clear reasons to stay in town, Elena observed. None of them fits the runaway profile Sheriff Crane described. Marcus studied a map of the area, noting geographic features that would favor certain types of criminal operations. We're less than 30 miles from the Canadian border, with multiple unmarked rural roads that could facilitate smuggling operations. The isolation provides operational security, and corrupted local law enforcement ensures minimal interference. Tomorrow we start talking to families regardless of what Sheriff Crane prefers, Elena decided. But tonight, we gather intelligence about this town's actual power structure. They spent the evening conducting discreet reconnaissance, observing the community's patterns of activity and identifying key locations that seemed to attract unusual attention. Marcus's military training and surveillance techniques combined with Elena's undercover experience allowed them to move through the town without attracting notice, while gathering valuable intelligence. There's a warehouse complex about 2 miles outside town that's showing signs of recent activity, Marcus reported after returning from a walking reconnaissance. Fresh tire tracks, security lighting that's been recently installed, and what looks like living quarters that have been hastily constructed. Elena had spent her time observing the social dynamics at the town's only bar, noting conversations that stopped when strangers approached and behavior patterns that suggested widespread fear. The community knows something terrible is happening, but they're too scared to talk about it, she said. I counted at least 6 people who started to approach me, but then changed their minds when they noticed others watching. Classic intimidation tactics. Someone's made it clear that cooperating with outside authorities has consequences. As they prepared for sleep in the sterile motel room, Elena found herself reflecting on how much had changed since that night she had crawled through snow seeking only survival. Then, she had been alone, desperate, and convinced that no one would fight for her. Now she had a partner who shared her commitment to justice and the skills to help her protect others who found themselves in similar circumstances. Marcus, she said quietly in the darkness, do you think we can actually make a difference in places like this? Communities where corruption is so entrenched that victims don't even try to seek help. Marcus considered the question, thinking about the transformation in his own perspective since meeting Elena. 6 months ago, I would have said no. I would have argued that some problems are too big and too systemic for individuals to address. He paused, remembering the moment he had first seen Elena crawling through the snow. But then I met someone who refused to accept that injustice was inevitable. Someone who proved that fighting back is possible, even when the odds seem impossible. Elena felt a familiar warmth in her chest, the sense of partnership that had become central to her identity. We saved each other that night, didn't we? You pulled me out of the storm, but I think I pulled you back into the world. We saved each other, Marcus agreed. And tomorrow we're going to save 3 women who deserve to have someone fight for them. Outside their motel room, the North Dakota night was cold and clear. Stars visible in numbers that reminded both Alana and Marcus of the Montana sky under which their partnership had been forged. Somewhere in this isolated community, criminals were operating with the confidence that comes from corrupted institutions and intimidated populations. But they were about to discover that some people couldn't be bought, threatened, or discouraged from pursuing justice. Elena Rodriguez and Marcus Sullivan had learned that lesson in Fire and Snow, and now they were ready to teach it to anyone who thought they could hide their crimes behind rural isolation and official corruption. The work they had chosen would never be easy, but it would always be necessary. And as long as they faced it together, no storm would be too fierce and no enemy too powerful to overcome. Their partnership had been forged in crisis, proven under fire, and now consecrated to the service of justice for those who had been forgotten by everyone else. Some stories end with rescue, but theirs was just beginning with purpose. The next morning brought unexpected developments that would test their partnership in ways they hadn't anticipated. Elena was reviewing surveillance footage from the motel security cameras when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. A black sedan with tinted windows had circled the motel 3 times during the night, stopping briefly in positions that would allow occupants to observe their room. Marcus, she called quietly, we may have a problem. Marcus examined the footage, his expression growing grim as he recognized the surveillance pattern. Professional observation. Someone wanted to confirm our location and assess our security posture without engaging directly. The question is whether it's local criminals or if word about our investigation has reached higher levels of the organization. Elena saved the footage to her encrypted device. Either way, they know we're here, and they're treating us as a threat. Their morning reconnaissance took on new urgency as they realized their presence had triggered responses that suggested the local criminal network was more sophisticated than initial intelligence had indicated. The warehouse complex Marcus had observed the previous night now showed signs of increased activity, with multiple vehicles arriving before dawn and security personnel taking positions around the perimeter. They're either preparing to move operations or getting ready for some kind of confrontation. Marcus observed through binoculars from a concealed position overlooking the facility. Either option suggests we've applied pressure in the right place. Elena was monitoring radio communications using equipment that could intercept unencrypted transmissions, picking up fragments of conversations that confirmed their suspicions about the scope of the criminal operation. I'm hearing references to packages being moved ahead of schedule and concerns about federal interference, she reported. Someone's definitely panicking about our presence. Their investigation was interrupted by an unexpected visitor at their motel room. A young woman in her early 20s knocked hesitantly on their door, looking around nervously as if afraid of being observed. "Are you the federal agents asking about the missing girls?" she asked when Elena answered the door. "I'm Agent Rodriguez." "What's your name?" "Tracy Morrison. I worked with Sarah Chun at the diner before she disappeared." Tracy's voice was barely above a whisper, her eyes constantly scanning the parking lot. "I know what happened to her, but I can't talk here. Too many people watching." Elena and Marcus exchanged glances, recognizing the importance of this potential breakthrough while also understanding the danger it might represent for Tracy. "Where would you feel safe talking?" Marcus asked gently. "There's an abandoned farm about 5 miles north of town. My grandfather's place. Nobody goes there anymore." Tracy handed Elena a hastily drawn map. "Meet me there at noon. And please, don't tell anyone you're meeting me. If they find out I'm talking to you ... She didn't finish the sentence, but the fear in her eyes communicated everything Elena and Marcus needed to know about the consequences facing anyone who cooperated with their investigation. After Tracy left, Elena and Marcus spent an hour planning their approach to the meeting, understanding that it could be either a genuine breakthrough or an elaborate trap designed to isolate them from any potential backup. "We go armed and with communication protocols in place," Marcus decided. "If this is legitimate, Tracy Morrison might be the key to understanding what happened to those 3 women. If it's a trap, we need to be ready for whatever they're planning." The abandoned farm was exactly as Tracy had described, a collection of weathered buildings surrounded by fields that had been left fallow for years. Marcus positioned himself with overwatch capability while Elena approached the main farmhouse where Tracy was waiting. "Thank you for coming," Tracy said, her relief evident at seeing Elena arrive alone. "I wasn't sure you would believe me." "Tell me what you know about Sarah Chun," Elena encouraged, settling into a position where she could observe both Tracy and the approaches to the farmhouse. "Sarah didn't run away. She was taken." Tracy's voice gained strength as she began sharing information she had clearly been carrying for months. "There are men who come through town regularly looking for specific types of girls. Young, pretty, without strong family connections. They work with local people to identify targets." Elena felt familiar rage building in her chest, recognizing the systematic approach that characterized professional trafficking operations. "Who are these local people?" "Sheriff Crane is involved, but he's not in charge. There's a woman named Victoria Kellerman who runs the operation. She owns the warehouse complex outside town and several other businesses that are really just fronts for moving people." Marcus's voice came through Elena's earpiece, confirming what Tracy was telling them. "I've got eyes on 3 vehicles approaching from different directions. We may be about to have company." Elena made a quick decision. "Tracy, we need to get you somewhere safe right now. If people are coming here, they're probably not planning to let you continue talking to federal agents. I can't leave town. They'll know I'm gone and they'll hurt my family." Tracy's fear was genuine, but so was her determination to see justice. "Done, but I can give you something that proves what I'm telling you." She handed Elena a small digital camera that had been concealed in her jacket. "Sarah gave me this the day before she disappeared. She'd been taking pictures of the warehouse operation, trying to document what was happening so she could report it to someone who would listen. Elena quickly scrolled through the camera's contents, seeing images that confirmed everything Tracy had described. Photographs of young women being loaded into unmarked vans, documentation of license plates and faces of people involved in the operation, and most damning, images of Sheriff Crane meeting with individuals who were clearly not local law enforcement. "Tracy, this evidence could bring down the entire network," Elena said, securing the camera in her tactical pack. "But you're right that we need to get you to safety before anyone realizes what you've shared with us." Marcus's voice carried new urgency through the earpiece. "Elena, we've got armed personnel taking positions around the farmhouse. This is definitely not a social call." Elena made rapid calculations about their tactical situation, weighing the need to protect Tracy against the necessity of preserving the evidence she had provided. "Tracy, is there another way out of this building?" "There's a root cellar that connects to an old storm shelter about 200 yards from here. My grandfather built it during the Cold War." Tracy led Elena toward a concealed entrance in the farmhouse floor. "The tunnel comes out near a grove of trees where I parked my car." As they moved through the underground passage, Elena could hear vehicles surrounding the farmhouse above them. Whoever was coming had arrived in force, suggesting that Tracy's decision to contact federal agents had been discovered and was being met with significant response. "How did they know about our meeting?" Elena asked as they reached the storm shelter. "Someone must have seen me talking to you at the motel. Or maybe they're monitoring communications somehow," Tracy replied. "But it doesn't matter now. What matters is that you have the evidence Sarah died trying to gather." Elena felt the weight of responsibility that came with holding evidence that could bring justice for multiple victims, while also understanding that the people trying to suppress that evidence were willing to kill to protect their operations. "Tracy, you can't go back to town. If they're willing to attack federal agents, they won't hesitate to eliminate anyone they see as a threat. Agent Rodriguez, this is my home. These are my friends and neighbors being hurt by these people." Tracy's voice carried the same determination Elena had felt when she crawled through snow rather than surrender to David Martinez. "I'm not running away from a fight that needs to be fought." Elena recognized something of herself in Tracy Morrison's refusal to be intimidated by forces that seemed overwhelming. But she also understood the tactical reality of their situation. "Then we make sure you're protected while we build a case that ends this permanently," Elena decided. "Marcus and I didn't come here just to gather evidence and leave. We came here to make sure the people responsible face justice." As they emerged from the storm shelter into the grove of trees, Marcus was waiting with their vehicle running and weapons ready for immediate departure. "Status?" Elena asked as they quickly loaded Tracy into the back seat. 8 armed personnel searched the farmhouse thoroughly but didn't find the tunnel entrance, Marcus reported. "They're regrouping now, probably planning to expand their search." Perimeter. Elena made a decision that would define the next phase of their investigation. Instead of retreating to safety and requesting backup, she chose to escalate their direct confrontation with the criminal network. "We're not leaving," she announced. "We have evidence, we have a witness, and we have people who are desperate enough to attack federal agents in broad daylight. That desperation means we're close to something they can't afford to lose." Marcus smiled grimly, recognizing the tactical mindset that had made Elena such an effective undercover agent. "What's the plan?" "We turn hunters into prey. Victoria Kellerman thinks she controls this territory through intimidation and corruption. Time to show her what happens when that strategy meets people who can't be bought or scared away." Tracy Morrison looked between Elena and Marcus, seeing in their partnership the same kind of determination that had driven her to risk everything by contacting federal agents. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. Elena felt the familiar surge of purpose that came with choosing action over retreat, justice over safety. "Help us end this, permanently." The abandoned farm fell silent behind them as they drove toward Confrontation that would determine whether justice or corruption would control this small community. Elena Rodriguez and Marcus Sullivan had learned that some fights were worth any risk, and some partnerships were strong enough to face any enemy. Their story had begun with rescue, but it was continuing with a choice to stand and fight for people who deserved better than a system that had forgotten them. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe. And turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.